The truth avoidants don't want you to know about no contact. You've probably heard about the no contact rule after a breakup. Maybe you've even tried it. You delete their number, you stop texting them, you pull back, hoping they'll chase you, notice your absence, or suddenly realize your worth. But here's the truth that avoidance, especially those emotionally unavailable people we can't seem to let go of, don't want you to know no contact isn't about getting them back. It's about getting you back. That scares avoidance. Why? Because the moment you start valuing peace over chaos, the moment you realize you don't need their breadcrumb attention to feel validated, they lose the power they never should have had in the first place. Let me break it down. People who fear intimacy often thrive on your inconsistency. They don't want the full relationship, but they don't want to fully lose you either. So they linger. They check your story. They send, "Hey, how are you?" texts at 11:04 p.m. on a Wednesday, and we think maybe they do care. No, they don't miss you. They miss your attention. They miss the ego boost. They miss knowing you were available when they were ready. But the moment you go no contact, not to punish them, not to manipulate, but to reclaim yourself, they panic. Not because they love you, but because they can no longer feed off your emotional energy. Here's the part no one talks about: avoidance respect what they can't control. The second you show that your life doesn't revolve around their inconsistency is the moment they're faced with something terrifying, their own emptiness. So if you're in no contact right now and wondering if it's working, ask yourself, are you doing it to teach them a lesson, or are you doing it to teach yourself that you deserve better? Because the truth is, no contact isn't the test you give to them. It's the test you pass when you finally decide to stop settling for half love. No contact is often misunderstood as a strategy to manipulate someone into missing you, but in reality, it's a deeply personal and necessary boundary designed to help you reconnect with yourself. It's not about punishing the other person or creating distance to provoke a reaction. It's about stepping away from the noise and confusion that a toxic or inconsistent connection often brings. When you go no contact, especially with someone emotionally unavailable or avoidant, you're not trying to get their attention. You're removing your own from a dynamic that has been draining your energy and self-worth. There's a difference between space that's used as a game and space that's used for healing. When you choose no contact with the intention of healing, you are declaring that your peace is more important than any mixed signals, delayed texts, or temporary highs. That act alone begins to rewire your internal narrative. Instead of asking, how do I make them realize what they lost? The question becomes, how did I lose parts of myself in this connection, and how do I get them back? Avoidance and emotionally unavailable people often leave you in limbo. They offer just enough to keep you hopeful, but never enough to make you feel secure. That inconsistency chips away at your confidence and sense of clarity. You find yourself obsessing over what their messages mean, questioning your worth based on their behavior, and altering your own boundaries just to maintain some connection. No contact removes you from that mental tug of war. It creates a space where you're no longer waiting on their next move, you're making your own. The power of no contact lies not in its effect on them, but in what it teaches you about yourself. It teaches you to sit with discomfort instead of chasing temporary relief. It teaches you that silence can be healing, not empty. It shows you that your value doesn't depend on who checks in, who notices, or who stays. Often, when we're entangled in an emotionally draining relationship, we lose sight of how much we've been over, giving just to keep something alive. No contact becomes the line in the sand that says, I'm no longer going to betray myself for the sake of connection. This decision, though painful, is a powerful act of self-loyalty. It's not about being cold or heartless, it's about being honest. Honest about the fact that you deserve to feel loved, safe, and chosen, not confused, anxious, and uncertain. And the only way to get there is to remove yourself from the patterns and people who keep you stuck in survival mode. No contact isn't the end of a relationship, it's the beginning of self-respect. It's the moment you stop asking someone else to choose you and start choosing yourself fully without apology. Avoidants operate in a confusing emotional rhythm. They crave connection, but the moment it becomes too close, too real, too vulnerable, they pull away. And in that space between closeness and distance, they thrive on your inconsistency. Not because they want a stable relationship, but because they're more comfortable in emotional chaos than in genuine intimacy. when you're unsure of where you stand, when you're constantly second guessing their feelings, they are in control. That imbalance isn't accidental. It's the fuel that keeps their avoidant attachment comfortable. People with avoidant tendencies often feel safest when there's just enough emotional distance. If you come too close, they feel overwhelmed. If you back off, they come chasing just enough to pull you back in. This push-pull cycle becomes a pattern you start to normalize. Even though it leaves you anxious, confused, and unfulfilled, you might think, if I just say the right thing, or show them I'm patient, or wait long enough, they'll come around. But this is exactly where avoidants feel most comfortable when you're guessing, waiting, adjusting, trying to prove your worth. Your inconsistency, driven by their mixed signals, becomes their emotional playground. They don't want full commitment because that would require vulnerability and emotional responsibility. But they don't want full disconnection either because your presence, your attention, your hope, your emotional investment gives them validation without requiring them to show up in the same way. They benefit from you staying just close enough to reassure their ego, but never close enough to challenge their fear of intimacy. This is why your inconsistency, your willingness to stay in the gray area, becomes the trap. You might not even realize how much you're bending, compromising, and overthinking just to keep a connection alive. But every time you respond to a breadcrumb text, every time you ignore your own needs just to avoid rocking the boat, you're reinforcing a dynamic that leaves you emotionally malnourished. And the avoidant, knowingly or not, continues to draw from that. What they don't expect is for you to step out of that cycle. When you stop being inconsistent, when you become decisive, clear, and committed to your boundaries, they lose that grip. That's when they start to feel the absence of control. Not because they want to love you better, but because they're losing the emotional supply your inconsistency gave them. They miss the power they held, not the relationship itself. The uncomfortable truth is that many avoidants aren't drawn to love. They're drawn to control masked as connection. And inconsistency gives them just that. When you're emotionally disoriented, they feel safe. When you're confused, they feel secure. The moment you stop feeding the cycle, the dynamic shifts. But until that point, they will keep leaning on your inconsistency like a crutch, never fully present, but never fully gone. Because that in-between space is exactly where they feel most in control and exactly where you lose yourself. When someone avoidant or emotionally unavailable reaches out after a period of silence, it's easy to believe they miss you. That hope is powerful. It plays directly into the part of you that's been waiting for validation, for a sign that the connection meant something. But here's the deeper truth. In most cases, they don't miss you, they miss the attention. They miss the role you played in their life, the emotional comfort, the reassurance, the ego boost. What they miss is how they felt when they had access to you, not necessarily the relationship or who you are as a person. This distinction is crucial because when you confuse their momentary reach out with emotional growth or a change of heart, you reopen a door that was closed for a reason. It's seductive when someone who's pulled away suddenly reappears. It feels like a victory. It feels like maybe they've come to their senses. But for many avoidants, the trigger to reach out isn't love. It's discomfort. It's boredom. It's the realization that the validation you once gave them is gone. They're not seeking connection. They're seeking relief from the silence. And who better to turn to than the person who always responded? They're not necessarily thinking, I miss their soul, their laugh, our connection. It's more often, I wonder if I still have access. That kind of message isn't love. It's a check in with their ego. It's an emotional reflex, not an emotional investment. They want to feel important again. They want to feel that you're still orbiting around them. And the moment you respond, especially if it's warmly or with curiosity, they get what they came for, proof that they still matter without having to truly show up for you. This is why you might notice a pattern. When you respond and reopen that line of communication, they vanish again. Or they stay just long enough to get attention and then retreat. That's not confusion on their part. That's a cycle. And in that cycle, they're not reconnecting with you. They're reconnecting with the feeling of being desired, wanted, needed. It's not about rebuilding a relationship. It's about recharging their sense of control. If someone truly misses you, they will make that clear through changed behavior, consistent presence, and emotional vulnerability. They will take accountability for their past actions, and they will show that they want to build something real, They won't breadcrumb you, and they won't need you to decode their intentions. But when someone just misses the attention, they'll send vague messages, stir up emotions, and offer nothing of real substance. And if you're not careful, you'll confuse their shallow reach out with deep care. That's why discernment is everything. You have to ask yourself, do they miss me, or do they miss the version of me that made them feel good about themselves? Because someone who truly values you will never gamble with your heart for the sake of feeding their own. Avoidants often navigate relationships with one core motivation: emotional safety. But not the kind of safety that comes from vulnerability or connection. Instead, they feel safe when they're in control, when the emotional stakes are low, and when there's enough distance to prevent intimacy from becoming too real. This is why setting firm emotional boundaries disrupts everything they're used to. It forces them to confront the very discomfort they've spent their lives avoiding. When you implement no contact, or when you stop engaging in their patterns, you're not just withdrawing attention, you're forcing them to face themselves without the buffer of your energy. For someone avoidant, your presence, especially when you're emotionally available, acts as a cushion. They can keep you close enough to feel wanted, admired, or desired, but far enough to avoid any deep emotional responsibility. It allows them to sidestep their own fears, issues, and insecurities while still enjoying the benefits of connection. But when you take that away, when you stop texting first, when you stop entertaining their hot and cold behavior, when you stop explaining your worth, the cushion disappears, and what they're left with is silence. Not just the absence of your words, but the absence of distraction from their own unresolved emotional discomfort. Emotional boundaries act like a mirror. When you stop playing into the cycle, they're forced to confront the reason that cycle existed in the first place. They can no longer rely on your reassurance to silence their doubts or your attention to feed their ego. The space you create with your boundaries becomes a space they can't control, and that's terrifying for someone who has learned to regulate their emotions by controlling the dynamics around them. When you don't give in to their reappearance, when you don't respond to their vague check-ins, when you don't fall back into old roles, they're suddenly standing alone in the consequences of their emotional avoidance. This is not to say your absence magically transforms them, but it does remove the escape route they were using, you. Without the emotional availability they once depended on, they might begin to experience the anxiety, loneliness, or emptiness they were projecting onto the relationship all along. For someone who is used to avoiding emotional reflection, this can be deeply unsettling. That's the power of boundaries. They don't just protect your energy, they also illuminate the truth of the dynamic for the other person. Avoidants rarely confront themselves willingly. It's usually only when someone refuses to keep feeding the illusion of connection that they're forced to see the ways they've been hiding. That's why your silence, your boundary, your refusal to play along, it's not just empowering for you, it's revealing for them. It exposes what the relationship actually was without your emotional labor covering its cracks. And for many avoidants, that's the first time they're forced to see the full picture, not just who you are, but who they've been in the presence of someone who finally chose peace over potential. There comes a moment when the need for clarity becomes louder than the desire for connection. That moment is often the turning point in any emotionally confusing relationship. When you choose to walk away from someone who gives you just enough to keep you hoping, but never enough to make you feel secure, you're not giving up on love, you're choosing self-worth over approval. And that is where real transformation begins. For so long, your energy may have been invested in interpreting mixed signals, managing your reactions, or trying to prove that you're worth staying for. But approval that you have to chase is not the kind of love that sustains or fulfills you. The truth is, people who fear intimacy often condition you to question your own value. They may never say it outright, but through their actions, their inconsistency, their emotional distance, their inability to fully show up, they plant doubt. And over time, you begin to seek validation from the very person who is incapable of giving it. It becomes a loop. You're trying to get someone to see you, but in the process, you stop seeing yourself. You make their acceptance the prize, and you ignore all the ways you're being emotionally depleted. Choosing self-worth means breaking that cycle. It means looking at the situation not through the lens of how much potential it has, but through the reality of how it makes you feel. Do you feel anxious more than you feel safe? Do you feel seen, or just temporarily noticed when it's convenient for them. When you finally decide to walk away from what confuses you, it's not a loss, it's a declaration. A declaration that you no longer need to earn what should be freely given respect, effort, clarity, presence. This shift doesn't come from anger or resentment. It comes from exhaustion, from the deep realization that loving someone should not cost you your peace. That being wanted is not the same as being valued. That breadcrumbs are not a feast and silence is not affection. When you stop trying to decode every message or justify their lack of effort, you begin to see just how much you are settling for. And in that awareness, you find your power. This is when everything changes. Because the moment you choose self-worth, you stop negotiating with confusion. You stop accepting the bare minimum. You stop allowing someone else's emotional limitations to define your sense of love. You become less interested in whether they'll come back and more focused on never abandoning yourself again. That's not bitterness, it's clarity. That's not giving up, it's leveling up. And in doing so, you shift the dynamic completely. You're no longer standing in the space of waiting. You're walking forward, grounded in the belief that the love you're worthy of will never require you to lose yourself in the process. Let's be real, going no contact isn't easy. It forces you to sit with your own pain, your own urges, your own patterns. But it also gives you something far more valuable than temporary comfort. It gives you back in a world where so many are afraid of intimacy, afraid of showing up fully, afraid of being honest with themselves. Your courage to walk away from confusion is rare and powerful. No contact isn't silence, it's a statement. A statement that you will no longer beg for crumbs at a table where you deserve a seat and a full meal. A statement that your heart is not up for negotiation with someone who can't handle it. And to the avoidants, the emotionally unavailable, the inconsistent, know this: you don't get to keep someone on standby while you figure yourself out. Respect is not found in words sent at midnight. It's shown in consistency, presence, and effort. To everyone listening, remember this: you are not hard to love. You are just used to being in spaces that couldn't hold what you brought. So if you're wondering whether no contact is the right choice, ask yourself this: are you ready to stop proving yourself to someone who was never truly available to begin with? Because the second you stop fighting to be chosen, you start choosing yourself. And that is where your freedom lies. Thank you so much for being here. Whether you're in the thick of heartbreak, healing, or already stepping into your power, this conversation matters. Not just for your relationships, but for your self-respect, your peace, and your future. Keep choosing clarity over chaos. Keep choosing peace over patterns. And above all, keep choosing you. Take care of yourself. You're worth it. Thank you and goodbye.